removal, I think whether you think about natural or technological carbon removal, there is a general consensus that we need to do everything we can to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and rein in increasing temperatures. Today we will explore how carbon removal is essential to complement emission reduction efforts, but we will also explore what kind of collaborative efforts are required across stakeholder groups to scale carbon removal to gigaton scale. And we will certainly seek to explore some of the tensions and critique of carbon removal in terms of proportionality and risk as well. So to do so, I'm delighted to be able to bring the perspective of one of the world leading banks, Deutsche Bank, fully committed to spearheading the Net-Zero transition, and the world leading carbon removal player, Climeworks. So since COP has started, we have seen already agreement falling in place to enable further implementation of the carbon markets as a way to help finance climate action, and carbon removal obviously plays a significant role in this. So a few words of introduction about myself. I'm Sophie Lambin. I'm the founder and CEO of Kite Insight and of the Climate School. And we really work with people in companies mostly to equip them with an understanding of those technologies and the part they play in the mix, as well as equipping people with the tools and understanding of the kind of capital allocation decision they need to make to contribute to the net zero journey they are all in. So let me move then to introducing briefly my speakers. To the left of me, there's Adrian Sigritz and then Jörg Eigendorf. Adrian is the Chief Commercial Officer of Climeworks, who is hosting this conversation. Climeworks hits a few major milestones in the last 12 months, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more from you, Adrian, in a minute. They became part of the US Department of Energy funding program for direct air capture hubs and announced several long-term offtake agreements. Recently, Climeworks solution now offers to help companies define the holistic carbon removal strategy, and we'll explore that further. You saw recently the inauguration of Mammoth, the world's next largest direct air capture and storage plant, and you delivered the first certified direct air capture credits. If there's anything you don't understand about that, I'm sure Adrian will tell us more in a minute. Jörg is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Deutsche Bank. Some of recent achievements include being part of the Alliance of CEOs Climate Leaders for the World Economic Forum, a member of the UN-convened Net-Zero Banking Alliance, and Deutsche Bank has also defined both an operational net-zero target by 2030 and a 2050 net-zero target, including finance emission. So it's a great pleasure to have you with me today. And maybe, Jörg, I'll start with you by asking you to set a little bit of the context as the world's largest bank. And how do you go about setting these such targets in terms of your both your 2030 and 2050 targets, both as a bank yourself, but also as a financial advisor of your clients?
Thank you so much. It's to jump straight into this topic, and it's maybe turns out to be could talk long about this topic, because what is the challenge of a bank? The challenge of a bank are the financed emissions. Our own operations are 45,000 tons a year right now. Then you have scope 3, 1 to 14. This is our supply chain. This is another 1.3 million tons. Then you have the financed emission of our corporate loan portfolio, committed, not drawn. Drawn is half of the number, but committed is more than 60 million tons. So that shows you what we have, what our challenges is. So the main focus, and if you think about the CSRD approach of materiality, then you really focus on your financed emission, be it on the residential real estate portfolio, 2.5 million tons, or the corporate loan portfolio, drawn 30 million, committed 60 million. So there we have to work. We have 7 sector pathways. We have linked these sector pathways to management board compensation. We have by now carbon budgets for the single divisions of our corporate bank and our investment bank. so everybody knows how to manage it. We are managing it with real-time data effectively that you can see where you are. We have a Net-Zero forum I chaired together with our head of enterprise risk, and we have divisional Net-Zero fora where these decisions are taken. So there are a lot of things we are doing to manage financed emissions. But that's not the topic of today, because if we use Climeworks carbon capture to compensate for our loans, there would not be a single loan anymore. Right? Just to give you the dimension, that would be the price for compensation would be almost as high as interest for the loan. I mean, it eventually the cost would go up. The question right now we are asking ourselves to think strategically about it is, what are we doing with our own operations also, and with regards to compensation, and with regards to air travel and travel mainly, because that is, if you think own operations, it's 50,000, 45,000, there's another 45,000 roughly for travel. So let's think about 90,000 tons a year, which we can really compensate, and then we have to think about supply chain 1 to 14, and then we have to think about financed emissions if we want to compensate it. We have a commitment to net zero, and that's very clear. What we are doing right now, the approach for our own operations is really, we stopped saying we are carbon neutral. I think the word carbon neutral is out of that's gone. We think much more strategically now about how do we want to tap into the market and how do we link compensation also to other business. So we think of chunks of that, not just buying some carbon removal credits, but also thinking of getting into alliances, having a strategic dialogue. I, as a chief sustainability officer, have the strategic responsibility for our developing and implementing our strategy across the businesses, across the regions, across the functions. So let's think strategically about it and put it into little piece parts. That can be sustainable aviation fuels for our aviation compensation. That could be that schemes like, which are more sophisticated, like Climeworks, that can be more sophisticated removal schemes, like we see, or avoidance schemes, that can be planting trees in Brazil and then financing that company. So we have many approaches here, and right now we are very strategic about it. So you really need to think in these buckets. The net zero strategy is always avoidance. We have reduced our own carbon emissions by 90% in 10 years. So 90%, it's a huge number. The last 10% going to be hugely difficult. But let's face it, we are not an industrial company, we are a bank. Doing it with a bank is much easier. You just move from one building to another and you may have reduced your carbon emissions by 50%. Easy, done. But in air travel and all of these things, you really need to think so sophistically. And I want to do that in a strategic approach, using and compartmentalizing it a little bit, and also thinking about how do we get into business with our vendors who sell us carbon credits, and really believing in these things, and how can we finance these companies, how can we provide banking services to these companies that they can grow quickly, because this is a market that has to develop very quickly.
Thank you. Adrian, maybe you can talk a little bit of your experience of working with the financial sector.
Yeah, actually, let me start by saying, from having worked with over 100 chief sustainability officers and sustainability teams at Fortune 500 companies across sectors, in my view, one very important element that is often underestimated is how important it is that the sustainability team is really ingrained in the business, and as Jörg has nicely pointed out, is truly a business-minded strategic function. That's what we typically see where the most action can be taken and the most progress is being made. From the partnerships that we have signed in the last 12 months, essentially all of these sustainability teams had exactly that mindset, close to the finance department, close to the CFO, etc. When we talk now more on the actual work that needs to be done, um, as well, Deutsche Bank is an interesting kind of case study or example where, yes, the big part of the work of the journey to net zero needs to be reduction. Reduction in your own value chain, or in the example of a bank, reduction in your portfolio. That's where you have massive impact. However, climate science and policymakers alike agree, and this is very different from 2 or 3 years ago. We have consensus today that we do need roughly 5 to 10 gigatons of carbon removal supply in 2050. And in order to get there, the only way we can get there is to start small today, also on carbon removal. So yes, the big effort, 90% of the work is reductions, but if we delay action on the removals part, we won't have a industry to supply the removals that are needed. And now, how do companies go about that? Maybe just a few words on that. They typically, companies think in waves. Yeah. So they pick, for example, Scope 1 emissions, or as Jörg pointed out, Scope 3 travel emissions, and they secure a first wave of access to carbon removal credits, which helps them to actually start walking the talk. And there's actually also a business case in most cases. We can talk a little more about that later. For every industry, for every leading company, there is a business case today to start small with carbon removal. And when they secure that first wave, they start learning, they start seeing how the market works, they have a stake in this future trillion-dollar industry, and then they typically build on from there. We have a couple of strategic partners where we already signed our third partnership agreement, meaning they're already at wave 3, but that's typically how we work.
Do you want to comment on that?
I absolutely agree to the point. First of all, I need to correct myself. I got a little bit ahead of myself. You just mentioned 90. We were 80% down in 10 years, not 90%. So you just mixed up a little bit of number. First of all, yes, it is about reducing, but don't get into any ideological debate on that. I give you my very plain view on, I think humankind is intelligent but not sensible. We are reducing the carbon. I mean, effectively, let you make a vision of this world, which is very ugly. We just reduce the absorption capacity of our world further. We build a lot of machines of Climeworks all over the place. We have no biodiversity anymore, and we achieve net zero. Terrible world. So we need to think of, first of all, reduction. Second of all, protecting and rebuilding our environment. And for that, we need to get a price for the environment. I think things like companies like Climework will help us in that. Why? Because eventually, hopefully, humankind will become sensible and think, okay, if Climeworks right now, I think you offered me some 600 per ton or so, that's wow. If it's that expensive, why don't we protect the nature first? But we all agree, and I come to the thing, it won't work only with protecting the nature. That train has left the station. And the longer we take, and I just come from an NDC discussion of the World Economic Forum, just 50 meters away from here, where it's absolutely clear that we are much too slow. We are much behind. And the further we are behind, and this is a sad news, the more successful Climeworks will be if they can scale their business model. And the more we will need this absorption capacity. So we're not talking about a net zero world. We are talking, we need to go beyond net zero eventually if we want to save that planet. And live on a planet where we don't have repercussions, which will be political, which will be democracies in danger, which will be just creating an environment in which we can't live anymore. So I think he's absolutely right. We need to work into this direction, and we will have to have carbon capture. As much as I would like to see the oceans, and you said about the 5 to 10 gigaton, we need at least 10 gigaton from the oceans. And right now, the oceans turn carbon positive and not negative. They're not absorbing anymore, and the rainforest is not absorbing enough anymore. And we need, and the land's the same thing. So it's a huge work, and this is one element, and it puts, and this is a good thing with Climeworks, you put a price, a real price to it eventually, and you always have to think then where can we allocate our money the best? And the market has not taken a decision yet where it is the best to put your stakes. The thing is with Climeworks, it works so, these kind of credits, they work so well from a financial perspective. Yeah, you can buy them, you put them on your balance sheet, and it's credible, and so on and so on. CFOs have not a view on, oh, I invest into a forest regeneration program, and how do I put this on my balance sheet? And we need to get there, the same mechanism that internalize the externalities of doing business.
Are you, in effect, pointing to the risk that this carbon removal investment could divert capital away from other initiatives that would be more around carbon reduction?
I hope we are, look, the biggest problem we are having, Sophie, is that we not putting a price to nature and to protecting nature. You need to put a price to protecting nature. Those who protect it need to make a fundamental profit with this. And a world in which we only pay for those things which humankind is building, but not what nature is building or God has built. I mean,
Right.
you're religious and I am religious. So then you are in a completely absurd world. So we permanently need to, I don't want to rely on Climeworks. I want to rely on models. First, for me, it's reducing. Second is investing into nature. Third is then comes these kind of models of mankind-made carbon capture. This must be the line, and only then it's sensible. But we need to do it in an economic way because I'm working in a bank, and I can tell you, usually things only work when they are economically driven. Otherwise, you're immediately in the corporate responsibility corner, or you are in the philanthropy corner. Very important. CSR is important. Philanthropy is important. But we have to understand, if we want to get all the economic agents behind us, it needs to be economically reasonable. And there are a lot of things right now which are economically reasonable, and where sometimes even those old agents who are doing business are doing everything to impede those who can be economically successful, that they are not successful in the battery business and all the other things.
Adrian, I, having read the positioning of Climeworks, I know you're very mindful about this positioning that we first need to reduce. How do you respond to that, to those critique about, this is an expensive technology, it's not yet fully tested, it could give some people a full sense of security? Can I hear you out a little bit on this?
Yeah, actually, I thank you for asking that. We at Climeworks, we don't see it as a critique. Why we don't see it as a critique? Because we fully agree, actually, with that statement. There is a nuance to it, though. There's controversy in some corners, and actually that is fading away now, but there used to be a controversy, let's say, of, oh, can we just set up these carbon capture machines and continue as is? And gut feeling, one could think, oh yeah, that is indeed a danger, right? Like that we just continue as is, and we put up these massive plants, and we're good, but destroy nature. The reality is that argument, that scenario makes absolute no economic sense. Carbon removal only works in conjunction with a world that dramatically reduces its emissions. Why? Because the carbon removal industry can scale to roughly 5 to 10 gigatons. It can never scale to 40, 50, 60, 70 gigatons. That's simply A, not feasible for many reasons, and I don't want to get into the details now, and B, it's not economic. So no economic rational actor would ever do that. So having said that, we still need to start small today on carbon removal. So I disagree with the statement. That's the only thing I would like to point out. We cannot wait. It's not we do first one thing, then the second thing, then the third thing. Because if we would take that approach, then we will end up, let's say in an ideal scenario, year 2049, and the world, humanity has reduced emissions by 90%. Now we need the removals, but they're not there. And so it's important that we very considerate at a small scale, slowly start to ramp up removals. And to your last question, can removals distract from reduction efforts? Again, the removals industry, if we just compare orders of magnitudes, investment into the removal industry 3 years ago was roughly zero. We had a massive growth, 700% CAGR per year in terms of demand, and we're now roughly at $2 billion. If you think of the amount of investments that go into reductions, if you count in renewables, solar, wind, batteries, etc., we're already at $2 trillion. So order of magnitude, reductions is 1,000x larger in terms of investment than removal. So distraction is a little hard to see there.
You want to react to that?
Yes, we need to be, and I think we need to put it in perspective. When I met with your CEO, Christoph, last year, um, I think you were capturing 4,000 tons a year. And I just compared it. We have 48,000 tons in Deutsche Bank in own operations, and we are a bank, and own operations is small, and we have reduced already by 80%. So it needs 10 times the capacity of Climeworks last year just to compensate for Deutsche Bank. That puts it in perspective. At the same time, we need to be super strategic. And by the way, it's not the CFO you need to be integrated with. I need to be deeply integrated in the businesses. Because if I only come around the corner, first of all, I think it's very important that we stopped calling ourselves carbon neutral. Because that's the first step of creating this kind of good feeling where there's no reason to have a good feeling, because we have to understand you can compensate for it, but you can never really compensate for it. Finally, you need compensation is super important, but it needs to be a strategic part. And when you look into strong compensation, then you need to really look into what are the certain steps. Biodiversity is super important. Give you an example why, even if Climeworks, and I don't, all my conversations with Climeworks, I've never had the impression that they thought we will save the world. But there is geospatial data now. If you look at geospatial data, then eventually in 5 or 10 years' time, you will have data for every slot in the world where you can really then say, that's the biodiversity, these are the risks attached to it, and so much. There's so many more risks than just the climate change risk by itself. So you need to have nature in your planning, in every assessment. We need the biodiversity in order to get to order to have the nature services we need. And nature services provide at least as much GDP to the world as the humankind GDP is producing. So as you're saying, in a logic world, but having said that, it can become much more efficient eventually to capture more and get there quicker. And this is a little bit the problem. The longer we wait now, the more we will rely on this humankind way of capturing, and the bigger is the danger that the loss of biodiversity will have detrimental effects on our living, and for sure on our economies.
And actually, to comment on that, at Climeworks, we strongly believe tech and nature need to work hand in hand. That's why Climeworks became a carbon removal solution provider in the last 18 months, meaning we're not only offering direct air capture to our partners, but we actually start from the strategy where we design together with our partners their carbon removal journey. How are they going to address their unabatable emissions? And then we design a high quality carbon removal portfolio for that share of unabatable emissions, which is composed of both mankind tech-based carbon removal and nature-based carbon removal. And depending on the, let's say, priorities of companies, these portfolios can look very different, right? Like for some, biodiversity is today highest. I mean, it should be a priority for everybody, but is weighted higher versus others want to see co-benefits in terms of job creation, etc. And that leads to a fact that we see high demand across companies to essentially have a holistic portfolio of carbon removal solutions integrating tech and nature, and not only focusing on one specific approach
Yeah,
out of the 14 that exist out there to do so.
great. And now I want to switch to something you alluded to is the role of corporate in scaling carbon removal. Can you maybe talk to some success stories with early adopters? What are the challenges you face? What is the role that you see in maybe key industry sectors of corporates? And I know there's a whole discussion about standards that are needed for corporates to scale carbon removal. But can we talk a little bit about that as you see it?
The standards are very important. We have seen in the, let's say, carbon avoidance credit market, there were issues in the past, and we strongly believe in the carbon removal industry and market. We absolutely have to be airtight with providing a trusted carbon credit to the market. Otherwise, we lose trust, and that would mean we cannot make progress. So quality comes first. Quality at its highest level, meaning 1 ton of carbon removal purchased equals 1 ton net of carbon removed from the air and stored in the ground. The role of corporates is absolutely crucial. When I often get asked the question, what is the biggest challenge that Climeworks faces? And a lot of people expect me to say it's the technology or it's the supply chain. Now, these are challenging parts as well, don't get me wrong, but the real big barrier that we have to scale even faster is the fast growth of the market. Hence, if every Fortune 500 company would set out and say, we start small, we put out a let's say, small part of their emissions and get access to carbon removal credits today for that part, that would be a massive boost to the industry and would allow all companies to scale up even faster.
What's your experience in seeing what are the main points as corporates consider entering the carbon removal?
The main impediment for this market, and let's face it, technologies like the one we are talking about here are not among those 50% of the technologies where we can say they are already market ready, and effectively governments would need to create a better environment for those technologies to work faster, but they're almost ready. I talk about heat pumps, I talk about electric vehicles, and all of these things that reduce carbon emissions. This is a technology which is advanced already, but it's not market ready at that sense. So it's the same like with SAF, yeah, with sustainable aviation fuel. We have a price, and you could ask yourself, why is the price for sustainable aviation fuel 3 to 6 times or 4 times higher than the price for traditional aviation fuel? You would come to the answer, because the traditional aviation fuel is just wrongly priced. I mean, it's just not internalizing the externalities of doing business. So, but the problem is then, how do we get then that this market, that it makes really economic sense to invest into sustainable aviation fuels, and their corporates are important. They can now do offtake contracts. As I said before, the 45,000 tons we have are compared to this 60 million committed tons in our finest emissions. they are not that material, but we can do small parts. If all corporates would do now smaller parts of that, then that market that would create a security for those who try to offer these products, create a security to build that market. That market would develop very, very quickly. And what we see when we do project finance and these things is we always ask when we go into a project finance, okay, where's the revenue stream? Is there any guarantee for the revenue stream? And if you don't have any revenue stream behind it, we can't bank it. That means what you see in the world right now is when you talk about those first 50%, a lot of these things are bankable already, these projects. If you talk about the other 50%, which are absolutely necessary, they're not bankable. Why are they not bankable? Because we would have to put so much capital below it from a regulatory perspective that it would be completely uneconomical to invest into this. And by having off-takes and contracts and commitments, not soft commitments, to hard commitments, hard money behind it, that means we can bank these projects. We can do a project finance. And when we talk about project finance, we don't talk about 3 or 5 years. A normal project finance contract has 15, 20 years. This is a time we need to finance these things. So you need to have these long-term contracts. And I think getting in there is either by voluntary action, like the Net-Zero Banking Alliance, but that's a different story, but voluntary action, or eventually you have blended finance behind it, but you need to make these things bankable, it needs corporates to commit to it. And to have corporates commit to it, unfortunately, I can see a lot of self-regulation, which has been super successful, Net-Zero Banking Alliance. Having said that, and if you really look what is happening there, we are just at the start, and I think this is a very important success story, how we manage now our carbon emissions, how we have budgets, how we see when there is a breach, how we measure management against it, link it to compensation. This is a way to work. But if voluntary doesn't work, and if we permanently get attacked by, oh, this is antitrust, this is a antitrust issue, you can't do this, then we get, because it's wrong, it's just very principle-based rules we do. Yeah, we all committed to publish our net zero pathways. Then we would get into obligatory systems, because otherwise we won't get there. CSR and philanthropy is important, but won't save the world. That's absolutely clear.
Thanks, Jörg. Adrian, what would you say you need the most of in order to, from your point of view, to scale Climeworks?
Jörg said it very well, and I can use what you just laid out and apply it to a concrete example. So Climeworks is set out to build its first megaton, so million-ton facility in the United States, and wants to start operations on that in 2.5 years from now. It's going to be built at the border of Texas and Louisiana, where there's abundant renewable energy and we can store the carbon in the ground. And there is land available. Plus, there's the skills of the oil and gas industry that can be transformed to our industry. So that is a community benefit to people in these areas. But what we need the most is, as Jörg said, we need to show to our project finance investors that we have a market for the lifetime capacity of that megaton facility that we're going to build in the United States. And as soon as we can show more than 50% of the lifetime capacity of that plant, it's going to run for 25 years. As soon as we can show offtake for that, we can get from some of the largest project finance investors in the world the capital in to start building it and start operating it. And that is exactly how wind, how solar, how batteries have scaled up in the last 20 years. And that's the exact same model that we need to apply to our industry.
Yep.
Adrian makes a very important point here, and this is something that worries me in today's world a little bit. Very interestingly, this is, just think about politically what color these states have, Texas and
I was
Louisiana.
going to ask.
Yeah, and Interestingly, you have industrial policy behind it, Inflation Reduction Act. We also see, for example, in China, a very strong industrial policy on e-vehicles and batteries and so on. Democracies often, and especially Europe, has its problems with kind of industrial policy approaches because effectively that takes away the gap. If you want to get these things to market, and if you just want to wait for the market to decide, oh, this is efficient enough, it won't happen. Won't happen early enough, not with regards to climate change. We are not in a world anymore where we have time. We have no time anymore at all. So we need to scale up these solutions quickly. So you need governments to get in there. Then it becomes very interesting. So you need a government guarantee or a tax credit or whatsoever in Inflation Reduction Act. Then usually you have a blended finance. You have a development bank maybe behind it. Then you have a bank. That means the bank and the development bank, they cover the debt financing. And usually you need equity in there. The equity investor usually is the first to come. They want high margins. They invest into 10 companies. 9 go bust. One compensates for the 9 that go bust, and you make a fortune with that. But you need to think in these very pragmatically in these time frames. If you don't have an organized approach, you won't get there, and or you will lose a lot of time until you're there, or you will then be forced to copy what others have done already, or just import it, and then you may come to the idea that, oh, we better have income tariff, we have tariffs in order to avoid that these competitors who have done a more or less smart industrial policy that they will win against us now. So there are a lot of things right now. We need to get these things economically sensible. So once you have them, it is economical to invest into something. Everything will happen by itself, and it goes right with certain frameworks of the government. But to get to this point, that is a big challenge. And as we don't have 30 years to wait, we need to act now very quickly and decisively and ensure the financing for these projects. But let me give you another very impressive example, because you talked about Texas and Louisiana right now. In Brazil, you have more than the size of Germany in degraded land, which is not profitable anymore, even from an agricultural perspective. Would I want to see that filled with Climeworks machines? Or would I like to have a regeneration of the land? I would like to see the regeneration of the land and then find those places where you can really use that. Then the guys still have enough to do.
That's the case in Iceland, if I'm not mistaken. Your place in Iceland would fall into that category. So, yeah, quick question, Adrian. Do you expect anything to change with the Trump election?
I think it's still a little early to tell. What I can say is that interestingly enough, carbon removal and direct air capture is one of the few things in today's US politics that is truly bipartisan and has bipartisan support. So in terms of building the supply and getting these projects up and running, I don't expect anything to change. How it will look like on the demand side, the picture is a little bit more complex.
Great. So 2 wrap-up questions to close this panel. First one is, what are you expecting from Baku in terms of outcome from your respective point of view? And then second question is, if we project ourselves in COP30 Belen next year, what story would you like to tell, each of you from your own perspective, in terms of your own priorities? Maybe Adrian, we start with you.
Yeah, so for this COP, there is progress on Article 6.4 and 6.2. That is a good thing for the carbon markets, because it helps with, in the long term, making it a compliance market and setting the rules and standards. That's a good thing. For COP30, I want to see or I hope to see, of course, action across the board for our industry specifically, that tech and nature-based carbon removal are dramatically scaling up its supply, and we're getting closer to a truly functioning market.
Yep.
I agree with Adrian. What we need to see is carbon removal markets and carbon compensation, voluntary carbon compensation needs to turn into a functioning market, because it would help us tremendously also to put a value to the protection of nature and biodiversity. And this is, we need to make a step forward here with regards to that, next to the adaptation fund, which I think is super important too. But I think that would be a big success, and we need to go down that road. And for the next year, I think the big challenge for all of us is we have focused very much on carbon in the last 10 years, 5 years. We have operationalized carbon. Operationalizing nature is much more complex. You just cannot, you don't have a CO2 for land. It's not just square meters. It's just a qualitative difference. CO2, a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. A square meter of land, an acre of land is not an acre of land. Water is the same. It is getting much more sophisticated from the data. We need to leapfrog there. And a final point to your question before, to Adrian, what is the implication? What I think, we are right now at a watershed moment. I hope we are far enough that it makes no sense anymore to go back, and that every politician in this world, and hopefully the most powerful ones, understand this. Second is I should have ended with this sentence, because what I'm afraid of right now is the psychological effect. And if people stop thinking, oh, we can deprioritize sustainability right now, then they will it will just happen. It will become a self-fulfilling prophecy that is super dangerous. And our first economic minister in the Federal Republic of Germany, Ludwig Erhard, said it's half of the economy is psychology. The good thing is, and we Germans had a very good successful model, the social market economy, where we set a frame. It's called ordoliberalism, which means a liberal economy, but you have a government that sets the boundaries and sets a reliable, and the reliability, I think, of politics. When I just heard the climate, the Brazilian representative for climate change talking about creating a plan for 16 sectors, creating a reliability. The worst thing that can happen for the economy now is to stop and go. Once you have a plan, go down that road, create that reliability. And if I hope something for Belém is that we can create this reliability and don't have to stop and go. Because if you have stop and go, then the naysayers will say, oh, look, that doesn't work. Why shall we go down up that mountain? Let's stay in the valley and have a party. And we should do everything that doesn't happen.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm really taking that point about a much more joined up approach between natural and technological carbon removal as a key message from that. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much.